Moving from the peripheral region into the spinal region, we said that the peripheral region was everything outside the vertebrae and spinal column. Well, the spinal region is all the neural structures contained within the vertebrae. So the spinal cord, the dorsal and ventral roots, spinal nerves, and the meninges. So I want to give you a little bit of a warning for this chapter, the spinal region chapter. We are not going to cover everything in the chapter. We're going to talk about the anatomy of the spinal region. We're going to talk about the functions of the spinal cord. We're pretty much going to skip lightly through the spinal cord motor coordination area. Um, and then we're going to talk about effects of segmental and tract lesions in the spinal region and differentiating spinal region from peripheral region lesions. And then we'll talk about spinal cord injury, traumatic spinal cord injury. So there's a lot in the chapter that you don't even have to read if you don't want to. And as you know, in this book, it gets pretty deep pretty quickly. So if you get stuck in there, let me know. I'll throw you a life preserver. But we're going to skip some parts. We're going to go over some parts, but let's try to keep it as simple and understandable as possible. In neuro rehab class next quarter, you will have a lot more on spinal cord injuries and the evaluation and treatment of spinal cord injuries. So this isn't all you're going to get. This is just the start of it. That's my little warning. So for this, just for this section, I want you to be able to identify some of the spinal region structures and what they contain: the dorsal root ganglion, ventral root, spinal nerve. We've heard all these before. So, like I said, the peripheral region was all of the structures outside the vertebrae. The spinal region is all the structures inside the vertebrae. So spinal cord, dorsal and ventral roots, spinal nerves, meninges. The spinal nerves carry all of the motor and sensory axons in a single spinal segment. So the spinal nerve roots. In the cervical region, the spinal nerves are found above the corresponding vertebra, except the eighth spinal nerve, because as we know, there is no eighth cervical vertebra. And the remainder, the spinal nerves, are below the corresponding vertebra. So when you're in the cervical region, spinal nerve roots C1 through C7 exit above the vertebrae. C8 exits above T1, and then T1 through S1 all exit below the vertebra. So hopefully that makes sense. But the spinal cord in an adult, in a regular sized adult, is significantly shorter than the vertebral column. So the levels of the spinal cord segments below C2 don't correspond exactly with the vertebral levels. So you can kind of see in this diagram how the nerve roots are getting kind of farther and farther up from where the vertebra is. So they don't completely correspond. So there is a little bit of a discrepancy between orthopedic diagnosis and neurological diagnosis levels of spinal cord injury. But we'll talk about, in the spinal cord injury section, we'll talk about the diagnosis of spinal cord injuries and how they define the levels. There is the ASIA, the American Spinal Cord Injury Association, has a standard way of defining the level of a spinal cord injury. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. But at the inferior end of the spinal cord, there is a bundle of connective tissue that's called the filum terminale, and there are glia that connect the end of the spinal cord to the coccyx. Because the spinal cord isn't present as a cord, below L1, there are long nerve roots that are continuations of the axons from the termination of the cord to where they exit the lumbosacral vertebral column. And the long roots are called the cauda equina, which means horsetail. within the lower vertebral canal. In the textbook, there's a great picture of the cauda equina it's a real anatomy picture of it, and you can see where they got that name, sort of. So the spinal cord itself has vertical grooves on the external spinal cord. So when we look at some of the drawings of it, you'll kind of see how they represent those vertical grooves. There's a deep anterior median fissure, and on the posterior or dorsal side, there's a shallow median sulcus. So there are also other sulci where the nerve roots emerge from the cord and bilaterally on the anterolateral of the cord, and the posterior cord has posterolateral sulci, and that's where the nerve rootlets enter the cord. So there's a lot going on in the spinal cord, and a lot of vertebrae, a lot of somas live there, a lot of entire neurons live there, the spinal interneurons, which are doing a lot of processing. And then all the motor nerves, synapse in the spinal cord, all the sensory nerves, synapse in the spinal cord. So there's a lot going on. But the nice thing about it is it's well organized. There's a segmental organization. So each segment of the cord is connected to a specific region of the body by axons traveling through a pair of spinal nerves. Connections to the nerve rootlets to the exterior of the cord in those anterolateral and posterolateral sulci indicate the cord segments. So it's very organized, even though there's a lot of complicated stuff going on in there. The ventral and dorsal roots are the cell bodies of the lower motor neurons are located in the ventral horn of the spinal cord, and their axons leave the anterolateral cord in small groups called rootlets. So ventral rootlets form a single segment, and they coalesce into a ventral root. So the ventral root is that all the different little nerve rootlets coming out and joining into that ventral root. The dorsal root contains sensory axons. So we talked about this before. The sensory axons bring information into the spinal cord, and they enter the posterior lateral spinal cord via the rootlets. Unlike the ventral roots, each dorsal root has a dorsal root ganglion. And as we know, a ganglion is a collection of neuron cell bodies usually with a common function. The dorsal root ganglion is technically located outside the spinal cord, and it contains the cell bodies of the primary sensory neurons, the first order sensory neurons. So where the sensory axons enter the spinal cord, those are the ones that are transmitting proprioceptive and touch information. Those are A beta fibers. We have also the small diameter C fibers and A delta fibers transmitting nociception and temperature information going into the dorsal root. So the dorsal and ventral roots join briefly to form a spinal nerve, and the spinal nerve is a mixed nerve because it contains sensory, autonomic, and motor axons. Spinal nerves are located in the intervertebral foramen. So when we put the two vertebrae together, we have the intervertebral foramen. That's where the spinal nerve exits the spinal cord. Cool, right? When we look at the horizontal section of the spinal cord, we can see the internal structure of it. So throughout the spinal cord, white matter, which is those vertical tracts that we've talked about, surrounds the gray matter. And the white matter contains the axons that connect various levels of the cord and link the cord with the brain. So neurons that begin and end within the spinal cord are called propriospinal neurons. The propriospinal axons are adjacent to the gray matter. Cells with long axons connecting the spinal cord with the brain are tract cells, and we talked about that in vertical systems. So we're kind of connecting everything together now. So the dorsal and lateral columns of the white matter contain axons transmitting sensory information to the brain. The lateral and anterior white matter contains axons of upper motor neurons conveying information descending from the brain to interneurons and then to lower motor neurons. So we already talked about all those specific tracks, and that's where they all are in the spinal cord. And they're all propriospinal neurons. And in this diagram, it shows the sensory ascending tracks on one side and the motor tracks on the other side. You really have both on both sides, but they separated it out for clarity. Hopefully that makes sense. And made the sensory ones blue and the motor ones red. They're all really the same color, which is white because of the myelin in the axons. So the central part of the cord is it's like an H-shaped pattern of gray matter. So the lateral sections of the spinal gray matter are divided into three regions called horns: the dorsal horn, the lateral horn, and the ventral horn. The dorsal horn is primarily sensory, containing endings and collaterals of first-order sensory neurons, interneurons, and dendrites and somas of tract cells. So they're the dendrites and somas of the second-order sensory neurons, if you want to think about that. So the somas of the second-order neurons in the spinothalamic pathway are in the dorsal horn. Kind of cool, right? So there's lots of every single little area in the spinal cord is named and described and whatever. Lots of dissection of spinal cords have been going on for the last 500 years or whatever. So they've really named the heck out of it. I don't expect you to know every single name of everything, just the general organization. So you can sort of think the dorsal horn processes sensory information. The lateral horn processes autonomic information, and the ventral horn processes motor information. When we start talking about spinal cord syndromes where certain areas of the cord are affected, this will make more sense. Or hopefully, this will help it to make sense. So, a lot of the gray matter is composed of spinal interneurons. So those include the cells that are entirely within the gray matter. So their axons travel like super short distances, or some of them, the axons travel in the white matter to different levels of the cord. So you might have a tiny little spinal interneuron that just stays at its own level, or you might have one that takes information from one level to another. So interneurons, they're the worker bees of the nervous system. Well, them and the microglia, but they are hanging out in that gray matter and doing a lot of stuff. Every little part of the gray matter is named too, and I don't expect you to know all the different nuclei of the gray matter. Just know that they're all named. So the meninges are just like in the brain, they're the layers of connective tissue that surround the spinal cord and brain. So the spinal cord meninges are continuous with the meninges surrounding the brain. The pia mater closely adheres to the spinal cord surface, just like in the brain, it closely adheres to the brain surface. The arachnoid is separated from the pia by the CSF, the cerebrospinal fluid, and the subarachnoid space is the space between the arachnoid and the pia mater. Between the arachnoid and the dura mater is the subdural space. So that kind of makes sense. The dura mater is the tough outer layer. Then there's the subdural space, then the arachnoid, then the subarachnoid space, then the pia mater. So it's 3 layers with space in between them. And in the space, we have fluid. So they'll talk about epidural anesthesia, and that's what this little diagram is. They actually inject the anesthesia into that subdural space. which is kind of cool that they could do that. And I don't know, it seems dangerous, but they do it every day. Sorry, I went somewhere there. Okay, the blood supply of the spinal cord, just like every single other part of the body, you need blood supply. And so the blood supply of the spinal cord is supplied by 3 spinal arteries that run vertically along the cord. One is in the anterior midline, 2 are posterior on either side of the midline, but medial to the dorsal roots. The anterior spinal artery supplies the anterior 2/3 of the cord, and the posterior spinal artery supply the posterior third of the cord. So, as you can imagine, the anterior spinal artery is kind of supplying more than each one of the posteriors. So you can have what's considered a spinal cord stroke if you have an ischemic event in these spinal cord arteries. And it's going to present like a spinal cord injury. So the spinal cord has to move, and the nerve roots have to move, just like everything in our body has to move. So you get static and dynamic deformations of the vertebral column. And when you move your limbs, those movements are directly transmitted to the spinal cord, nerve roots, and spinal cord and spinal nerves via the meninges. So the meninges are anchored to the skull and the vertebrae, and so flexion of the vertebral column stretches the spinal cord and the spinal nerves. The nervous system connective tissue is continuous. So when you're assessing neural tension by stretching the tissues, that's used as a diagnostic tool for assessing meninges, nerve roots, and peripheral nerves. So a lot of the testing that they do, they're trying to assess basically the integrity of the meninges and the nerve roots and the peripheral nerves. The slump test, which you probably haven't, you'll talk about it in your orthopedic classes, but that demonstrates the continuity of neural connective tissue. So basically, you're sitting in hip flexion, and you extend your knee in different sitting postures. And really, the neural tissue goes all the way from above your hip down to your toe. And so different positions are going to elicit different effects. So it's kind of interesting, and it's a good way to assess neural tension. So if you look in the peripheral section, if you look at some of the videos and the neural tension test for sciatic nerves, you'll probably see the slump test. So the nerve roots and spinal nerves are protected in a lot of ways by excessive mechanical loads. So for one thing, there's a lot of extra space in the intervertebral foramina. The interesting thing is you'll see various things. So you'll see 23 to 50%, you'll see 7 to 50%. So suffice it to say, the nerve roots and spinal nerves are not taking up all the space in the intervertebral foramina. There's space for them to move. They're also cushioned by fat. Yay, fat, right? The dural sleeves that surround the nerve roots within the intervertebral foramina protect against excessive mechanical loads because dural sleeves are strong and protective. The ligaments that maintain the spinal nerve within the intervertebral space and relieve traction on the spinal nerve also protect the nerve roots and spinal nerves from excessive mechanical load. So physiological motions don't significantly change vertebral canal space in people with normal vertebral canals. If you have vertebral canal stenosis, it is going to make a difference. But extending or lateral bending of the neck increases the intervertebral foramen pressure at all cervical levels. So remember the cervical spine, the little cervical vertebrae are tiny and the little openings between them are tiny. So if you extend your neck or if you laterally bend the neck, you're really increasing intervertebral foramen pressure. Um, so neck extension can increase cervical nerve root signs and symptoms. So if you that's another way that they're going to be testing um, to evaluate cervical spine dysfunction. So the spinal cord has that segmental organization, and segments of the spinal cord exchange information with other spinal cord segments and with peripheral nerves and with the brain. But it's not just a conduit. It's not just the information superhighway or anything like that. There's actual processing that goes on in the spinal cord. So there are some types of information, like really simple light touch and proprioceptive information. The dorsal column goes straight up to the medulla. There's not a lot of processing in the spinal cord. The processing for that happens in the thalamus. But a lot of the motor tract information that's carried to a motor neuron, there's other stuff going on. There are interneurons in the spinal cord. There are reflexes. There's a lot of sensory information that's feeding back to the neuron. So a lot of the modulation of motor modulation and sensory modulation happens in the spinal cord. So there's a lot of spinal cord influence on every aspect of our body.